But so Catherine and I are both LPL advisors, and we wanted to do this presentation because we know that the election is really top of mind for a lot of our clients. So I will have Catherine take over, share the screen, and she'll go through some of the presentations. We were not going to do any Q&A at the end because we didn't really want to get into some of the politics, but if you have any specific questions, you're obviously welcome to reach out to me directly.
Awesome. So, Seren, you can see that, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Let me just drag you guys over here and put you on the same screen. Okay. So this presentation is called People Care About Elections, Markets Don't. And one of the reasons we wanted to give this presentation is that we as financial advisors get a lot of great information that I think your typical reader may not, because we have providers who are sending us these just really interesting slides that support this notion of while we care personally about our particular candidate, the markets actually don't. So I'm going to jump into this presentation. So some of us may think that we are facing new problems, right? And what this slide is showing us is a Gallup poll questionnaire. This went back to June 30th. Invesco was updating it every 6 months. So as of June 30th, the poll to consumers is, what do we think are the most important problems facing the country? And in terms of the economy, people say the economy in general, which is interesting because we've been on a pretty good ride. High cost of living, inflation, for sure. Budget deficit, potentially. And then the non-economic worries, or what we consider problems: immigration, poor leadership, country unification. And what's interesting is we can go back to our country founders and actually see that they had the same types of concerns. So I won't read all of these quotes, but for example, Thomas Jefferson considered the central bank, or the Fed, a deadly hostility. Ben Franklin, inflation, talks about, right, is a gradual attacks upon us. We know that. We feel the effects of inflation. Alexander Hamilton wasn't crazy about the immigration. George Washington was talking about the temper of our country. So what we think are problems aren't actually new. And surprisingly, markets have performed well under both parties. So we do tend to identify with our particular candidate of choice, but the markets don't really care. So what this slide is showing us is going back to presidential terms starting in 1957 and the annualized stock market performance of each of those terms. This line here is a 10% annualized return. So most of our presidential candidates have actually returned 10% annually during their presidency. A couple outliers: George Bush started and ended in a recession, and Nixon had a little bit of a tough time, as we know. His candidacy, or his term, ended with Ford, who was up here. So stock markets historically have performed pretty well no matter who is in office. So this is actually really interesting as well. What we did is look back at the range of returns during administrations. And on average, each of these presidential candidates have seen a 1-year return of over 40%. And on average, each of these presidential candidates have seen a 1-year decline of 19%. So what this is potentially indicating is that, it's not necessarily rose under every presidency. There are some periods of decline, but on average, actually, we're doing pretty good, and they're very, very similar across candidates. So I love this chart. This is showing us the effect of investing per our particular candidate or party. So what this is showing us is a $10,000 investment in the Dow starting in 1896. And if we had stayed fully invested, meaning we're not going to change our investment strategy depending on who is in office, our portfolio would be worth over $9 million right now. If we had decided to get out of the market, in the market, out of the market, in the market, depending on who our particular party we were affiliated with, we would have earned a couple $100,000. So the reality is time in the market counts more than partisan investing. Some of us may think that this is the most important election of our lives. In reality, it's not. Historically, this has shown us. So what this slide shows us is since election day for Trump and Biden, fast forwarding the first 827 days of their administration, this brings us here. They actually returned exactly the same. Biden was close to 45% and Trump was around 50%. Then we had COVID, right? So then we see the disbursement. But the reality of our thoughts on this being the most important election historically doesn't hold true. So I find this one really, really interesting. So we tend to equate our candidates with particular causes or interests. And we might think that, you know, Trump is more supportive of oil and gas, Biden more supportive of clean energy. Well, the reality is, even though our political candidates have their particular agenda, the markets may not necessarily provide them with what their goals were. So this is showing us the clean energy index as attributed to the windmill versus the oil and gas with the drill. Under each of these terms, Trump and Biden. And it's the complete opposite of what we would expect. Now, there's a couple of reasons, right? We have the invasion of Ukraine. We have Middle East. So investing with one particular political agenda does not necessarily work for your long-term strategy. I love that slide. And let's also think about the US economy, because I do get sometimes concerns by clients saying, well, you know, this time's different. And I'm going to focus here on this left-hand chart. So what this is showing us is GDP, or gross domestic product, which is a measure of the health of our country. GDP, the equation for GDP is C, consumption, plus I, investment, plus G, government expenditures. So if we look, I'm going to explain this chart here, going all the way back to 1956. This dark blue up here is our consumption. So this is us as the consumer, right? We always talk about the health of the consumer. And on average, we're typically creating 60 to 70% of the overall health, the components of the GDP. Then we have business investment, I, which has stayed around 20%. This is the private sector. This low bar here, 20% and lower, is really the government. And this is where people talk about entitlements and additional spending, et cetera. But it's helpful when you look back in the historical context that reality, you know, doesn't matter who is in office, the components of GDP stay more or less the same. Doesn't matter who was in office. At the same point, sometimes people say, you know, deficit spending, one candidate or the other. And the reality is that neither party can really claim fiscal responsibility. So I'm going to explain this slide. The y-axis is percent of GDP and the debt, right? We're measuring the debt as a percentage of GDP. The black bar are our expenditures, and the blue bar is what we're bringing in. So when we see these gaps, this is our deficit. And the gaps are color coded depending on which party you're in. And so you can see there is plenty of red and plenty of blue, depending on which political party you prefer. So no one can really claim fiscal responsibility. And the last point that I'd like to say is our current interest expense on our debt is 2.4%. And what that means is we really want to create a higher GDP than that 2.4%. 2.4 is pretty low to be able to support those debt payments. So when we think that one party has, really subscribed to or prescribed to a particular philosophy throughout history, doesn't really matter. Neither party can really claim fiscal responsibility. What matters more for the markets is monetary policy. So we have an expression in my industry called "don't fight the Fed," right? So the Federal Reserve is making our monetary policy. And what we can see here when the Fed is in an easing period, which we are now, they just lowered rates for the first time, and we anticipate seeing more Fed easing or more rate lowering. The annual return for our presidential terms performs better. So we worry about fiscal policy. What matters really more is the monetary policy, and we're entering into an easing period, which tends to historically be supportive of the stock market. And markets don't care if you don't like who's president. So we think about a divided country, right? Anybody you ask, it's like, it's a 50-50. Who may win? 50-50. You have your candidate, the other candidate, 50-50. So I love this chart because what it's doing is showing us the presidential approval ratings going back to Kennedy, okay? This gray bar shows us that really mostly on average, our approval ratings are anywhere from 35 to 50. There are some outliers above, a little bit below. But we tend to feel like the world is falling out when the approval rating for a president has tanked. In reality, when we look at the stock market return as measured by the S&P 500, the annual rates of return tend to be better when our approval ratings are below 50. So I find that very interesting because, again, both parties or our affiliations, we feel a little bit nervous if somebody else is going to win. Doesn't matter who wins. The stock market actually returns better when there are lower approval ratings for our country. There were some outliers of Nixon and Bush in the war, et cetera, but so lower approval ratings. And when an administration starts matters more. This slide is showing both Reagan and Obama started terms during recessions, and their cumulative S&P 500 returns were well over 200%. The Fed actually was working towards easing conditions for them and restoring health. We have some of the same types of things happening now. So that's actually more important when the administration starts. And in conclusion, I mentioned before that what's more important for our clients' long-term financial health is time in the market, right? Not timing the market. And as financial planners, we are always interested in what's happening in the world around us and what is providing us with investment opportunities. And the reality is innovation in our economy is going to continue no matter who is in office. So this is just a few examples of some of the innovations that have been created since the 2008 election, right? We start with cloud computing, tablets, iPads, etc., social media, Ubers, virtual meeting software. I mean, we're on a Zoom today. Who knew, we would be doing this 10 years ago? And then fast forward to artificial intelligence. I mean, I can't have one day without seeing some news headline on how AI is going to improve my life, save me time. I mean, I'm actually really excited about what is happening out there in terms of the innovation economy. And time in the market is more important than timing the market. Seren and I are happy to help. Of course, we're always focused on long-term strategic financial planning. If you want to schedule time, please reach out. I hope this presentation was helpful. I find the historical data really, really interesting because we all think it's different, and the reality is it's not really that different. So that's it for the presentation. I don't know, Seren, if you want to make any last comments.
No, I thought it's really provoking, and I just want to kind of reiterate the point about how, yes, the election is really top of mind for a lot of folks, but the performance of the market is not directly correlated to politics. Like Catherine said, it's really more tied to the monetary policy, and obviously also with this slide, that's top of mind with the continued innovation that these companies that make up the stock market are going to continue to grow and invest in themselves. And really that's where it's our job to find those investment opportunities and help our clients reach their goals.